Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The perimeter was recorded as undisturbed, with all entry points double-checked for integrity and intactness. The interior displayed an immaculate arrangement, no possessions misplaced, nor items upturned. Anomalous residue, fine and granular, dusted the dining surface, although no similar material was traced to the ingress. Appliances registered normal function, timers precisely aligned, yet the aroma of overdone toast lingered anomalously in the air. Surveillance footage ceased intermittently at intervals, each gap precisely 7 minutes apart. The curtains drew themselves at dusk without assistance. All access codes verified as inactive, and still the scent persisted. That smell follows me everywhere now, burnt bread and something else underneath, something sweet and cloying that makes my stomach clench. I wake up tasting it on my tongue, that acrid residue coating my teeth like ash. The official report sits on my desk, pages crisp and white, but the words swim together when I try to read them. My hands shake when I touch the folder. I remember standing in that kitchen, the fluorescent light humming overhead like an insect trapped in amber. The countertops gleamed spotless, but my shoes crunched on something gritty with each step. Sand, maybe, or sugar. The sound echoed strangely in the silence, each footfall amplified and distorted until it seemed like someone else was walking behind me, matching my rhythm. The toaster sat there, chrome surface reflecting my face in fragments, warped, unrecognizable. I reached for the lever and found it warm, though no one had been in that house for days. That's what the logs showed, that's what everyone believed. But I knew better. The curtains moved without wind. I watched them sway, heavy fabric rippling like water, and felt something cold settle in my chest. A weight that hasn't lifted since. The windows were sealed, double-paned and secure, yet those curtains danced as if breathing, as if alive. 7 minutes, that's how long each gap lasted in the footage. 7 perfect minutes of nothing, black screen after black screen, while something happened in that house. Something the cameras couldn't see or wouldn't record. I've watched the remaining footage until my eyes burn, studying every frame, looking for shadows that shouldn't exist, movements in the periphery. The dining table held that residue, fine as powder, arranged in patterns that made no sense. Swirls and loops, almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. I ran my finger through it, and the substance felt warm, alive somehow, clinging to my skin with an oily persistence. When I tried to brush it away, it smeared, leaving traces under my fingernails that I scrubbed raw but couldn't remove. I taste metal now when I think about it. Copper pennies on my tongue, mixing with that burnt flavor until I gag. The report mentions nothing about taste, nothing about the way the air itself seemed thick and wrong, pressing against my lungs like liquid. The codes were inactive, every single one, but doors don't open themselves and houses don't rearrange their own furniture with surgical precision. Yet there I stood in a space that felt violated despite its pristine condition, sensing presence in every corner, hearing whispers in the electrical hum. My partner took photographs while I stood frozen by the window, watching those curtains move in their impossible dance. The camera clicked and whirred mechanical sounds that should have been comforting, but instead felt intrusive, like we were documenting something that didn't want to be seen. When we developed the film later, half the shots came out overexposed, white-hot blanks that revealed nothing. The kitchen timer blinked zeros at me, reset and waiting. but waiting for what? I pressed my palm against the toaster's surface and felt heat pulsing through the metal like a heartbeat. Steady, rhythmic, wrong. That's when I noticed the bread crumbs, just a few, scattered near the sink, golden brown fragments that crumbled to dust when I touched them. Fresh bread from a house where no one lived, no one visited, no one had access. The contradiction gnawed at my mind like hunger, insatiable and growing. The surveillance system recorded everything except what mattered. 7-minute intervals of darkness, perfectly timed, as if someone knew exactly how long they needed. But needed for what? The gaps appeared random at first glance, scattered throughout several days, but when I mapped them out on paper, a pattern emerged. A schedule, a routine. Someone had been living in that house. The realization hit me like cold water, sudden and shocking. All those perfect gaps, all those missing minutes, they weren't malfunctions, they were appointments. Scheduled disappearances from the record, carefully planned and executed with mechanical precision. I returned to the house alone against protocol, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The key turned easily in the lock, though the system showed no authorized entry. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing that same pristine interior, that same wrongness hanging in the air like smoke. The toast smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming, mixed with something else. Something organic and warm that made my skin crawl. I followed the scent through rooms that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, walls breathing in and out with subtle movements that registered only in my peripheral vision. The dining room table was clean, polished to a mirror shine, but I could still see those residue patterns etched in my memory. Swirls and loops that looked almost like letters now, almost like words in a script I should recognize but couldn't quite decipher. My reflection stared back at me from the table's surface, distorted and multiplied until I couldn't tell which face was real. Footsteps echoed from upstairs, slow and deliberate, though I knew the house was empty. I'd checked the logs myself, verified every access code, confirmed every entry point. Yet someone walked above me, pacing back and forth with measured steps that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking despite the house's apparent newness, and found bedrooms arranged with the same surgical precision as everything else. Beds made with hospital corners, surfaces dust-free, air-stale, and recycled, but one room felt different, warmer, lived in. The bed was rumpled, sheets twisted as if someone had just risen, and I could smell that same sweet undertone beneath the burnt bread aroma. Skin and sleep and something else I didn't want to identify. A glass of water sat on the nightstand, half empty, condensation still beating on its surface. I touched the sheets and they were warm. That's when I understood. The 7-minute gaps weren't hiding an intruder. They were hiding the absence of one. Someone who belonged there, someone who knew exactly when the cameras would look away, someone who lived in those missing minutes like a ghost haunting its own life. The surveillance footage resumed, capturing empty rooms and perfect stillness, while somewhere in the gaps between recording, life continued. Meals prepared and consumed, beds slept in, routines maintained in the spaces where no one was watching. Existence measured in 7-minute intervals, invisible and impossible. I stood in that bedroom breathing air that tasted of burnt toast and secrets, and felt the weight of understanding settle on my shoulders like a shroud. The official report would record anomalous residue and malfunctioning equipment. It would note the pristine condition and undisturbed perimeter. It would file everything away under unexplained phenomena and move on to the next case. But I would remember the warmth of those sheets, the condensation on that glass, the way the curtains moved without wind. I would carry the taste of burnt bread and the sound of footsteps that shouldn't exist. I would know that somewhere in the gaps between observation, someone was still there. Still living. Still waiting. The house breathed around me, walls expanding and contracting with subtle movements that registered in my bones rather than my eyes. I backed toward the stairs, each step deliberate and careful, while that sweet-sick smell grew stronger and the sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears like thunder. 7 minutes, that's how long I had before the cameras resumed recording. 7 minutes to leave, to forget, to pretend I'd never felt those warm sheets or tasted that impossible air. 7 minutes to become complicit in whatever lived in the gaps between seeing and knowing. I reached the front door as the surveillance system clicked back to life, red lights blinking like eyes opening after sleep. The lock turned with a soft snick, sealing away whatever existed in that space between recorded time, and I walked to my car on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The report sits on my desk now, pages clean and official, documenting nothing that matters. The toast smell lingers in my nostrils, stronger with each passing day, and sometimes I catch myself counting seconds. 7 minutes feels both infinite and instantaneous, a gap wide enough to hide a life or narrow enough to miss entirely. I don't sleep well anymore. Every dream tastes of burnt bread, and I wake with residue under my fingernails that won't wash away no matter how hard I scrub. The official explanation satisfies everyone else, but I know the truth lives in those missing minutes, in the spaces between what we record and what we see. Somewhere in a house that breathes and waits, curtains still move without wind, and toast burns in a kitchen where no one officially exists. The surveillance continues its faithful recording, capturing everything except what matters most, while in the gaps between observation, life persists in ways that make my hands shake and my stomach clench with recognition I don't want to acknowledge. The scent follows me everywhere now, and I understand that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be carried like weights that grow heavier with each breath, until the line between observer and observed blurs beyond recognition. I close the file and taste copper on my tongue, knowing that somewhere, someone is counting down 7 minutes until they can exist again. Story 2. The weight of silence. The candle sputtered out as I eased the door closed. The darkness was complete, wrapping around me like a second skin, carrying with it the scent of aged wood and forgotten rooms. My breath caught briefly in my throat, a subtle panic before reason took hold. Fingers brushed against the rough wall, feeling for the familiarity of chipped paint. The air felt heavier than it should have, like a held breath. I paused, senses sharpened. A sound just out of reach suggested something had shifted in the dark, though the echo never came back. I had been working as a private investigator for over a decade when the case found me, not the other way around as it usually happens. She walked into my office on a humid afternoon, her hands trembling as she placed a manila envelope on my desk. The woman wore a pale blue dress that had seen better days, and her eyes held that particular exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights and unanswered questions. "My sister disappeared," she said simply. No dramatic tears, no pleading. Just a statement delivered with the weight of someone who had already exhausted every other option. The envelope contained photographs, letters, and a list of names written in careful handwriting. Her sister had been 32, worked at a local library, lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery. The kind of person who waters plants religiously and remembers birthdays. The kind who doesn't just vanish without a trace. The police had classified it as a missing person case, filed the paperwork, asked the routine questions. But after several weeks with no lights, no body, no evidence of foul play, the investigation had quietly shifted to the back burner. These things happen, they said. Adults have the right to disappear if they choose to. But something in the sister's voice told me this wasn't a choice. I started where I always start, with the last known movements. The missing woman had left work on a regular weekday afternoon, stopped at the grocery store, bought milk and bread. The security footage showed her walking to her car, keys in hand, looking perfectly normal. She drove home, parked in her usual spot. After that, nothing. The apartment told its own story. Everything was neat, organized, exactly as someone would leave it if they planned to return shortly. Coffee cup in the sink, still bearing the faint ring of lipstick. Mail sorted on the kitchen counter. Bed made with military precision. The only thing missing was her purse and the clothes she had been wearing. I spent days interviewing neighbors, coworkers, friends. Everyone described the same person, quiet, reliable, predictable. She had no enemies, no debts, no complicated relationships, no reason to run, and no reason for someone to want her gone. But as I dug deeper, small inconsistencies began to surface. A coworker mentioned she had seemed distracted in the weeks before her disappearance, frequently checking her phone, jumping slightly when it rang. The woman who lived in the apartment below hers recalled hearing footsteps above at odd hours, pacing back and forth across the floor. The most unsettling detail came from the bakery owner downstairs. He mentioned seeing a car parked across the street several nights in a row, someone sitting inside just watching. When I pressed for details, he shrugged. Dark sedan, tinted windows, could have been anyone. I obtained her phone records through official channels. The last call she made was to a number I didn't recognize, lasting only 37 seconds. When I dialed it, I reached a disconnected line. The number had been registered to a company that didn't exist, using an address that turned out to be an empty lot. Sleep became elusive as the case consumed my thoughts. I would lie awake replaying conversations, searching for the detail I might have missed, the question I should have asked. The woman's face from the photograph seemed to watch me from my desk, her smile frozen in happier times. 3 weeks into the investigation, I received an anonymous call. The voice was distorted, mechanically altered, but unmistakably deliberate. "Stop looking," it said. "Some people don't want to be found." The line went dead before I could respond. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down. In all my years of investigation, I had never received a threat so calm, so matter-of-fact. It wasn't the words that chilled me, but the tone, as if the caller was stating a simple fact rather than making a warning. I traced the call, but it led nowhere. Prepaid phone, activated and discarded. Professional work. That night I returned to the missing woman's apartment building. The sister had given me a key, hoping I might find something the police had overlooked. I climbed the narrow stairs, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The hallway smelled of yeast and cinnamon from the bakery below, a comforting scent that felt wrong in the context of what I was investigating. Inside the apartment, I moved methodically through each room with fresh eyes. In the bedroom, I noticed something I had missed before. The dust pattern on the nightstand suggested something had been moved recently. A rectangular shape about the size of a jewelry box or small container. I called the sister and asked if anything was missing from the bedroom. After a long pause, she mentioned a wooden box their grandmother had given them as children. Her sister had kept letters and photographs in it, sentimental things. The box was gone. I spent the next day tracking down everyone who had access to the apartment. The the landlord, the cleaning woman who came twice a month, a few close friends who had spare keys. One by one, I eliminated possibilities until only one person remained unaccounted for, a man the missing woman had dated briefly several months earlier. Finding him proved more difficult than expected. The name the sister gave me led to a disconnected phone number and a forwarded address that no one had heard of. It was as if he had deliberately erased his trail, which in itself was telling. When I finally located him, he was working at an auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. He was younger than I expected, with calloused hands and nervous eyes that wouldn't meet mine directly. When I mentioned the missing woman's name, his entire body tensed. "We only went out a few times," he said quickly. "Nothing serious. I haven't seen her in months." But his hands were shaking as he spoke, and he kept glancing toward the exit as if calculating his escape route. When I asked about the wooden box, his face went pale. "I don't know anything about a box." The denial came too fast, too defensive. I pressed further, and he finally admitted they had argued during their last conversation. She had accused him of going through her things, of taking something that didn't belong to him. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, that he had never taken anything from her apartment. "She was paranoid," he said. "Always thought people were watching her, following her. I couldn't deal with that kind of crazy." But as I listened to him speak, I realized his description didn't match the woman everyone else had described. Paranoid wasn't a word anyone had used. Cautious, perhaps, private, but not paranoid. I left the repair shop with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that this man knew more than he was admitting. I decided to watch him, to see if his behavior would reveal what his words had not. For 3 days I followed him at a distance. His routine was predictable: work, home, a bar where he drank alone. But on the 4th night something changed. Instead of going home after work, he drove to a storage facility on the other side of town. I watched from my car as he used a key to enter one of the units. He was inside for less than 10 minutes, but when he emerged, he was carrying a small wooden box. My heart hammered against my ribs as I recognized the description the sister had given me. This was the missing piece, the thing that had been taken from the apartment, but why had he kept it, and what was inside that made it worth the risk? I followed him to a bridge that crossed the river running through town. He parked and walked to the center of the span, the box tucked under his arm. I watched from a distance as he stood at the railing, staring down at the dark water below. For several long moments he didn't move. Then, with a sudden motion, he hurled the box over the side. I heard the splash even from where I was parked, a small sound that seemed to carry enormous weight. He drove away quickly, and I was faced with a choice. I could follow him, or I could try to recover what he had just thrown away. The water was deep and cold, and darkness was falling, but something told me that box contained the answers I had been searching for. I called the police and reported what I had witnessed. By morning, divers had recovered the wooden box from the riverbed. The water had damaged much of the contents, but enough remained to piece together a story that was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Inside were letters, photographs, and what appeared to be copies of personal documents, bank statements, work schedules, even medical records. Someone had been systematically collecting information about the missing woman, documenting her daily routines, her habits, her vulnerabilities. But the most chilling discovery was a series of photographs taken without her knowledge, pictures of her leaving work, entering her apartment, shopping for groceries. Someone had been watching her for months, maybe longer, cataloging her every movement. The handwriting on the notes matched samples from the man I had been following, but when police went to arrest him, they found his apartment empty. He had disappeared as completely as the woman he had been stalking. The case officially remained open, but the investigation stalled. Without the suspect, without a body, without concrete evidence of a crime beyond stalking, there was little more the authorities could do. The missing woman became another statistic, another unsolved file in an overcrowded cabinet. But I couldn't let it go. Something about the entire situation felt orchestrated, too clean, too convenient. The anonymous phone call, the perfectly timed disposal of evidence, the suspect's convenient disappearance. It was as if someone had been anticipating my investigation, staying one step ahead at every turn. I began to wonder if the man I had followed was the real perpetrator or simply another piece in a larger puzzle. The methodical nature of the stalking, the careful planning, the ability to disappear without a trace suggested someone with experience, someone who had done this before. I started researching similar cases in surrounding areas, looking for patterns, connections. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past several years, at least 6 women had disappeared under similar circumstances. All were single, lived alone, worked regular jobs. All had been reported as acting nervous or distracted in the weeks before their disappearance. And in each case, a male acquaintance had also vanished shortly after the investigation began. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't dealing with a single crime, but with something much larger and more systematic. Someone was orchestrating these disappearances, using expendable accomplices to do the groundwork, then eliminating them when they became liabilities. But who was pulling the strings and why? I returned to the missing woman's apartment one final time, hoping to find some clue I had overlooked. The sister had decided to pack up her belongings, unable to bear the weight of the empty rooms any longer. I helped her sort through clothes and books, each item a reminder of a life interrupted. In a box of old photographs, I found something that stopped me cold. A group photo from what appeared to be a work function, taken several months before the disappearance. The missing woman stood in the center, smiling, surrounded by colleagues from the library. But it wasn't her face that caught my attention. In the background, partially obscured by other people, stood a figure I recognized. The same build, the same posture as someone I had seen before, though I couldn't immediately place where. I studied the photo more carefully, and slowly the pieces began to fall into place. The figure in the background was wearing a uniform, some kind of service worker, someone who would have had access to the building, who could have observed the employees' routines without attracting attention. I contacted the library and asked about their maintenance and security staff. After reviewing employee records, I found what I was looking for. A custodial worker who had been employed there during the time the missing woman worked at the library. Someone who would have had keys to the building, who could have learned her schedule, who could have watched her without being noticed. The employment records showed he had left his position just 2 weeks before her disappearance, citing family reasons. But when I tried to trace his employment history, I found gaps, inconsistencies, jobs that didn't check out when verified. This was the puppet master, the one who had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. He recruited vulnerable men, used them to do his surveillance and dirty work, then discarded them when they became inconvenient. The perfect crime with built-in scapegoats and no direct connection to himself. But proving it was another matter entirely. The man had covered his tracks carefully, and without concrete evidence, my suspicions were just theories. The missing woman was still missing, her stalker was still in the wind, and the real perpetrator remained free to continue his work. As I sit in my office now, writing this account, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The same sensation the missing woman must have felt in her final weeks. Phone calls where no one speaks. Cars that seem to follow the same route I take. Shadows that move when they should be still. I've shared my findings with the police, but without solid evidence, there's little they can do. The case remains officially unsolved, filed away with hundreds of others just like it. But I know the truth, or at least part of it, and I suspect that knowing makes me a liability. The candle on my desk flickers as I write these final words, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Outside, footsteps echo on the pavement, stopping just beneath my window before moving on. I've learned to distinguish between the innocent sounds of night and those that carry intention. Tomorrow I'll continue my investigation. I'll follow the threads that connect these disappearances, trace the pattern that links them together. I'll find the truth, no matter where it leads or what it costs. But tonight I'll sit in the darkness and listen to the sounds that shouldn't be there, wondering if I'm the hunter or the hunted, and whether the difference matters anymore. The truth is out there, buried beneath layers of deception and misdirection. And somewhere, a woman who loved her sister enough to keep searching deserves to know what happened in those final moments, in that space between normal life and whatever came after. The candle burns lower, wax pooling on the desk, and still I write because some stories demand to be told, even when no one wants to hear them. Story 3. It wasn't the first time the back gate was slightly ajar. The latch never truly clicked into place, swaying gently with the breeze just beyond my notice. Each morning I adjusted it, pretending it didn't make a difference. The garden hose lay tangled, its usual coil disrupted as if it had been hurriedly dropped. I never minded the freshly upturned earth near the oak tree, considering it a sign of natural growth. My gloves remained on the patio chair untouched, yet always ready. As I walked inside, I left the gate unlatched. I knew that anyone who cared to visit didn't need a formal invitation. The nausea comes first, always, a low churning that starts somewhere behind my sternum and spreads outward like ink in water. I press my palms against the kitchen counter, feeling the cool granite beneath my fingertips, but the sensation seems distant, as if my hands belong to someone else. The coffee maker gurgles its familiar morning song, but today the sound feels wrong, distorted, like listening to a recording played at the wrong speed. I remember her shoes, small white sneakers with grass stains on the sides. They sat by the back door for weeks, maybe months. I kept meaning to move them, to put them somewhere proper, but each time I approached, something held me back, a reluctance I couldn't name. The shoes seemed to watch me, their laces still tied in neat double knots, the way children learn to secure them tight so they won't come undone during play. The earth under my fingernails takes days to wash away completely. I scrub until my cuticles bleed, using a brush meant for vegetables, but tiny crescents of dark soil remain embedded beneath the surface. In the shower, I watch the water spiral down the drain, carrying away the evidence of my gardening, though I can't recall what I planted. The memory feels slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. She used to stand at the fence, her small fingers threading through the chain links, watching me work in the yard, never speaking, just observing with those dark eyes that seemed too old for her face. Her mother would call from their back porch, voice sharp with irritation, but the girl would take her time responding, as if savoring these stolen moments of observation. I pretended not to notice, but I could feel her gaze like heat from a distant fire. The shovel leans against the garage wall now, its blade clean and bright. I remember mud caked between the metal and wooden handle, remember the weight of it in my hands, heavier than it should have been. But when I check it now, it gleams like new, as if it's never touched earth at all. Memory plays tricks, I tell myself. Objects transform in our minds, become symbols of things they never were. My neighbor's dog stopped barking 3 weeks ago. The silence feels unnatural, a void where sound should be. I used to complain about the incessant yapping, the way it pierced through my morning quiet, but now I find myself listening for it, straining to hear even the faintest whimper from beyond the fence. The absence feels heavier than the noise ever did. There's a quality to disturbed soil that most people don't recognize. Fresh earth has a particular darkness, a richness that speaks of recent upheaval. It settles differently than ground that's been undisturbed, holds moisture in a way that creates subtle variations in color and texture. I notice these things now with an expertise I don't remember acquiring. The girl's mother came by last week, or perhaps it was longer ago. Time moves strangely now, elastic and unreliable. She stood on my front porch, her face drawn tight with worry, asking questions I couldn't quite process. Her words seemed to reach me through water, distorted and slow. I nodded and made appropriate sounds, but her expression suggested my responses weren't quite right, weren't matching the rhythm of normal conversation. I dream of small hands now, always reaching, always grasping. They emerge from dark soil like pale flowers, fingers spread wide as if trying to catch something falling from above. I wake with the taste of earth in my mouth, gritty and metallic, though I know I haven't been outside. The dreams leave me hollow, scraped clean from the inside, as if something essential has been removed while I slept. The gate swings open again this morning, that same gentle arc that never quite closes properly. I approach it with the intention of fixing the latch once and for all, but my hands hesitate over the metal mechanism. There's something almost sacred about its perpetual openness, as if closing it completely would violate some unspoken agreement I've made with the universe. Her voice echoes sometimes in the space between waking and sleep. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech, the particular pitch children use when they're trying to get an adult's attention. It rises and falls like a song I almost recognize, familiar yet impossible to place. I find myself responding to it, mumbling reassurances into my pillow, though I'm never sure what comfort I'm offering. The roses by the back fence have grown unusually well this season. Their blooms are larger than I remember, deeper in color, as if they're drawing nutrients from some rich, hidden source. I didn't fertilize them, didn't tend to them with any particular care, yet they flourish with an almost aggressive vitality. Their thorns seem sharper too, catching at my clothes when I pass, leaving tiny tears in the fabric that I don't notice until later. I tell myself that memory is unreliable, that the mind creates connections where none exist. The human brain seeks patterns, constructs narratives from random events, transforms coincidence into meaning. This knowledge should comfort me, should provide rational explanation for the unease that follows me through each day like a shadow. Instead, it only deepens the sense that something fundamental has shifted, that the world operates according to rules I no longer understand. The police came by yesterday, or maybe it was last month. Their questions felt rehearsed, professional, but underneath the practiced cadence I sensed something else, a careful watching, a measuring of my responses against some invisible standard. I offered them coffee, showed them through the house, opened doors and drawers with the enthusiasm of someone who has nothing to hide. But their eyes lingered on details I hadn't noticed before. The spotless condition of my gardening tools, the way my shoes were arranged by the door, the absence of any photographs on the walls. Sometimes I find myself standing in the backyard without remembering how I got there. The transition from inside to outside becomes seamless, as if I've sleepwalked through the motion of opening doors and crossing thresholds. I'll be holding something, a cup of coffee, a book, a pair of gloves, and have no recollection of picking it up. These gaps in awareness feel less like forgetting and more like editing, as if someone is carefully removing scenes from the film of my daily life. The earth near the oak tree has settled now, no longer showing the telltale signs of recent disturbance. Rain and time have worked their patient magic, smoothing away the evidence of upheaval, returning the surface to its natural state. Yet I can still see the boundaries of what was moved, can trace the outline of disruption like a scar that's healed but never quite disappeared. Her mother's tears fell on my front steps, each drop leaving a small dark circle on the concrete that evaporated almost immediately in the heat. She clutched a photograph, its edges worn from handling, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it directly. Instead, I focused on her hands, noticed how they trembled, how her knuckles had gone white from gripping the image so tightly. When she left, the concrete showed no trace of her sorrow, as if grief could be absorbed and hidden as easily as water. I've begun to notice how sound travels differently in my backyard now. Voices from neighboring houses seem muffled, distant, while small noises, the rustle of leaves, the settling of soil ring with unusual clarity. It's as if the acoustic properties of the space have been altered, as if the very air holds sound differently than it used to. I find myself speaking in whispers when I'm outside, though I can't explain why volume feels inappropriate. The garden hose continues to resist proper coiling. Each time I attempt to wind it neatly, it springs back into irregular loops, creating patterns that seem almost deliberate in their chaos. The rubber has developed a memory of movement, of being pulled quickly across uneven ground, dragged through spaces too narrow for its circumference. I've considered replacing it, but something holds me back, some sense that its current condition serves a purpose I don't fully understand. My hands have developed a sensitivity to temperature that borders on the supernatural. I can detect the warmth lingering in objects hours after they've been touched, can sense the cool spots where life has recently departed. The shovel handle retains heat long after I've set it aside, while certain patches of earth remain perpetually cold, as if something beneath the surface is drawing away all warmth. The neighbors have begun to watch me differently. Their glances carry weight now, a quality of assessment that wasn't there before. Conversations stop when I approach, resume in lower tones after I've passed. I understand this change. Intellectually, tragedy creates suspicion, transforms ordinary people into potential threats, but the emotional impact feels disproportionate to my rational comprehension. Each look becomes a judgment, each whispered word an accusation I can't quite hear. Sleep brings no relief, only deeper confusion. I dream of gardening in darkness, of soil that moves beneath my hands like living tissue, of roots that pulse with their own rhythm. Upon waking, my sheets are often damp with perspiration, and sometimes I find dirt under my fingernails despite having scrubbed them clean before bed. The boundary between dream and reality has grown porous, allowing elements to seep from one state into the other. The gate stands open again this morning, that familiar gap between metal and post that seems to mock my efforts at containment. I approach it with resignation now, understanding that some things resist our attempts at control, that certain openings are meant to remain unsealed. The latch hangs loose, its mechanism worn smooth by countless failed attempts at closure, as if the metal itself has learned the futility of trying to keep the world out. In the growing light, I can see new disturbances in the earth, subtle depressions that suggest movement in the night. Not large enough for human footprints, but too regular to be natural settling. They form a pattern I almost recognize, a sequence that tugs at memory without quite breaking through to consciousness. I kneel beside them, pressing my palm against the cool soil, feeling for vibrations, for signs of life beneath the surface. The roses continue their impossible bloom, their colors deepening with each passing day until they seem almost black in certain light. Their fragrance has changed too, becoming heavier, more complex, carrying undertones I can't identify but that make my stomach tighten with recognition. I should cut them back, should tend to them properly, but each time I approach with shears, my hands begin to shake and I retreat to the safety of the house. Understanding comes in fragments now, pieces of truth that surface briefly before disappearing beneath the murky waters of conscious thought. I catch glimpses of clarity in peripheral vision, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moment just before full wakefulness claims me each morning. But direct examination causes these insights to dissolve, leaving only the metallic taste of almost knowing on my tongue. The gate swings in the morning breeze, its arc describing possibilities I'm not ready to acknowledge. Behind me, the house waits with its clean surfaces and careful arrangements, its absence of photographs and excess of silence. Ahead, the world continues its patient revolution, carrying away evidence, smoothing over disturbances, transforming the extraordinary back into the mundane through the simple passage of time. I adjust the latch one more time, knowing it won't hold, knowing that some doors are meant to remain open, some invitations extended indefinitely into a future I can't quite imagine. The earth beneath my feet feels solid enough, but I can sense the spaces between particles, the tiny voids where secrets settle and wait for the right conditions to bloom into something that might eventually be called truth. Story 4. The door swung without a sound. My fingers, accustomed to the weight of it, met a void where expectation lingered. Each step across the worn carpet should have whispered back the weight of habit, but the floor absorbed everything. I reached for the wall switch, yet the light stayed dormant, refusing to accept its duty. In the dimness, the air carried a weight, a presence that pressed against the skin, invisible and insistent. I moved through the room, feeling the furniture like shadows, their essence slightly misplaced, like actors unsure of their roles. The window glass didn't cool under my touch. It felt too alive, contrary and strange. And as I paused, the room seemed to breathe, waiting for a script I had yet to understand. The power had been cut, obviously. That's what I told myself as I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer. The utility company had sent notices about maintenance work in our neighborhood, and I'd ignored them like I ignored most official correspondence these days. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing familiar shapes that somehow looked foreign in the stark white light. My partner had left that morning after our argument. Nothing dramatic, just the slow erosion of two people who'd forgotten how to speak the same language. The coffee mug still sat on the counter, lipstick traces on the rim like evidence of a life interrupted. I remember watching from the bedroom window as the car pulled away, tail lights disappearing around the corner with a finality that felt rehearsed. I'd spent the day at work pushing papers and answering phones, letting routine numb the sharp edges of our fight. When evening came, I drove home through streets that seemed emptier than usual, past houses where warm light spilled from windows like promises I couldn't keep. The normalcy of it all felt like a costume I'd forgotten how to wear. But as I moved through the darkened rooms, something nagged at the edges of my consciousness. The silence felt too complete, too intentional. Even without power, the house should have held its usual sounds, the settling of wood, the distant hum of traffic, the neighbor's dog that barked at shadows. Instead, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the soft scrape of my shoes against the floor. I found myself standing in the living room, flashlight beam dancing across surfaces that looked wrong somehow. The couch cushions bore impressions, but not from our bodies. The coffee table had been moved just slightly, maybe an inch or two, but enough to disrupt the careful geography of our shared space. A magazine lay open to a page I didn't remember reading, and the bookmark in the novel on the side table marked a spot I'd never reached. The rational part of my mind supplied explanations. Maybe my partner had rearranged things before leaving, a passive-aggressive punctuation mark to our argument. Maybe I was misremembering, stress and guilt coloring my perception of familiar spaces. Maybe the darkness was simply making everything look strange. But my body knew better. My skin prickled with the awareness of being watched, though I was alone. My hands trembled as I held the flashlight, and not from cold. The air itself felt thick, charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step creaking a different note than I remembered. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, doors standing slightly ajar like mouths caught mid-whisper. In the bedroom, clothes lay scattered across the floor, but not the clothes either of us had worn recently. They looked older, faded, as if they'd been waiting in that exact arrangement for years. The smell hit me then, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Something like rain on hot pavement mixed with the metallic tang of old pennies. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the house was exhaling memories I couldn't quite grasp. I sat on the edge of the bed, flashlight pointed at the floor, trying to make sense of the wrongness that permeated everything. That's when I noticed the photograph on the nightstand had changed. Not replaced the same frame, the same two people smiling at the camera, but something in their expressions looked different, more knowing, more sad. The rational explanation crumbled like paper in rain. This wasn't about power outages or rearranged furniture or stress-induced paranoia. This was about the other version of events, the one that lived in the spaces between what I remembered and what actually happened. In that other version, the argument hadn't ended with my partner leaving. It had escalated, voices rising until the neighbors must have heard. In that version, things were said that couldn't be taken back, accusations hurled like weapons designed to wound. In that version, someone had called the police. But that was impossible. I would remember something like that. I would remember the sound of sirens, the flash of red and blue lights painting our quiet street in emergency colors. I would remember the questions, the careful way the officers would have looked at both of us, assessing threat levels and credibility. Wouldn't I? The flashlight beam wavered as my hand shook. In its shifting circle of light, shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. The bedroom felt smaller, as if the walls were slowly contracting. My breathing grew shallow, and I could taste copper on my tongue. I forced myself to stand, to walk back downstairs to check the kitchen again. The coffee mug was gone, not washed, not moved, simply absent, as if it had never existed. The counter bore no ring stains, no evidence that anyone had ever sat there drinking morning coffee and planning a day that would end in argument and separation. My phone showed no missed calls, no text messages asking where I was or when I'd be home. The silence of it felt accusatory, as if I'd somehow failed a test I didn't know I was taking. I scrolled through recent calls, looking for proof of the life I thought I'd been living, but the numbers seemed foreign, belonging to people whose names I recognized but couldn't quite place. Outside, the street remained empty. No cars passed, no dogs barked, no porch lights flickered on as evening deepened into night. The world beyond our windows felt as hollow as the house itself, a stage set waiting for actors who might never arrive. I returned to the living room and sat in the chair that faced the window. The flashlight rested on my lap, its beam pointing toward the ceiling and casting everything in an eerie upward glow. In that light, my reflection in the dark window looked like someone I'd never met, older, more worn, carrying secrets I couldn't remember acquiring. The truth, I realized, wasn't something I could excavate through careful observation or logical deduction. It existed in the space between memory and reality, in the gap where certainty should have lived but didn't. Maybe my partner had left that morning. Maybe the argument had been real. Maybe everything I remembered was exactly as it happened. Or maybe I'd been sitting in this dark house for much longer than one evening, waiting for someone who would never return, holding on to a version of events that made sense only because the alternative was too frightening to acknowledge. The air grew thicker, pressing against my chest like water. My reflection in the window seemed to mouth words I couldn't hear, and for a moment I wondered if I was the one outside looking in, trying to understand what had happened to the person sitting in that chair. The flashlight dimmed, its batteries dying like hope. In the gathering darkness, I could no longer tell where the house ended and I began. The silence wrapped around me like a blanket, and I closed my eyes, letting both versions of the truth exist simultaneously in the space behind my eyelids. When morning comes, if morning comes, maybe I'll understand which story is real. Until then, I wait in the space between certainty and doubt, where all true mysteries lie. Story 5. It wasn't unusual for the back door to be slightly ajar in the mornings. The draft it let in was just one of those things, like the creaky floor near the pantry that everyone learned to step over without thinking. The mail sometimes arrived, sometimes didn't, but no one ever seemed concerned. The table by the window was the only piece of furniture that never collected dust, though nobody ever dusted it. As I glanced at the clock, its tick seemed a fraction off, yet the others in the room acted as if this was how it had always been. I left the kitchen light on, just in case. The coffee was still warm when I found the note, not on the table where notes usually appeared, but tucked beneath the sugar bowl like someone had placed it there as an afterthought. The handwriting looked familiar, though I couldn't place whose it was. The words were simple enough: check the basement again. But I hadn't checked the basement a first time, not that I could remember. I keep thinking about her shoes. They were still by the front door when everything else had been moved or rearranged. Sensible shoes, the kind worn by someone who walked a lot. The leather was scuffed in a pattern that suggested regular use, but the soles were cleaner than they should have been. When I mentioned this to the others, they looked at me with that particular kind of patience reserved for someone who notices the wrong things. The basement stairs creak on the 4th step from the top. I discovered this when I finally went down there, though I'm not sure what prompted me to go. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something organic that I couldn't identify. There were boxes stacked along the far wall, labeled in that same familiar handwriting. I opened one, old photographs mostly. People I didn't recognize standing in places that looked like they might have been important once. She used to hum while she worked. I remember this now, though I'm not sure when I forgot it. A tune that seemed familiar but incomplete, like a melody from a song you heard once in a waiting room. The humming would start in the kitchen around mid-morning and drift through the house until it became part of the ambient sound, like the refrigerator's hum or the settling of old wood. The photographs bothered me, not because of what they showed, but because of what they didn't show. Empty spaces where people should have been standing, shadows that fell in the wrong direction. In one image, taken at what looked like a family gathering, everyone was looking towards something just outside the frame. Their expressions were expectant, as if waiting for someone to join them. But the empty chair at the table suggested that someone had already left. I found myself returning to the basement more frequently. Each visit revealed something new, a tool that hadn't been there before, a different arrangement of the boxes, footprints in the dust that weren't mine. The organic smell grew stronger, though I could never locate its source. Sometimes I would stand at the bottom of the stairs and listen to the sounds from upstairs. Footsteps, voices, the normal rhythms of daily life. But when I climbed back up, the house was always empty. The note multiplied, not copies, but variations. Check the basement again became, did you check the basement? Which became, what did you find in the basement? The handwriting remained consistent, but the paper changed. Different colors, different textures. Some looked old, as if they had been written long before I found them. Others appeared fresh, the ink still slightly damp. Her absence became a presence. I started noticing the spaces she had occupied, the slight depression in the couch cushion, the coffee cup that remained unwashed in the sink, the bookmark holding her place in a novel she would never finish. The others spoke around these absences, their conversations carefully avoiding certain topics, certain memories, but the avoidance itself became a kind of acknowledgement. I began to document what I found. Not formally, just mental notes that I would review while lying in bed or standing in the kitchen waiting for coffee to brew. The pattern of dust on the basement floor, the way certain photographs seemed to change position in their box, the increasing frequency of the notes and their evolving tone of urgency. But documentation implied an audience, and I wasn't sure who that audience might be. The basement revealed its secret slowly. Not through any dramatic discovery, but through the gradual accumulation of small details. A piece of fabric caught on a nail, a section of floor that sounded different when walked on, the organic smell concentrating in one particular corner. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief could manifest in strange ways, that the mind seeks patterns even where none exist. But the shoes remained by the door. Even after everything else had been cleared away, boxed up, redistributed to relatives who would never use these objects but couldn't bear to throw them away. The shoes stayed, as if she might return for them, as if her absence was temporary rather than permanent. I stopped mentioning my discoveries to the others. Their patience had limits, and I sensed I was approaching them. Instead, I kept my observations to myself, turning them over like stones in my pocket, smooth from handling. The basement became my private investigation, though I wasn't sure what I was investigating or what I hoped to find. The last note was different, same handwriting, same paper as the first, but the message had changed. Stop looking. I found it in the same place, beneath the sugar bowl, on a morning when the back door was closed tight and the kitchen felt warmer than usual. The coffee was cold. The clock's tick had returned to its normal rhythm. The table by the window had collected a fine layer of dust. I keep the basement door locked now, not because of what I found there, but because of what I didn't find. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence, the silence its own kind of sound. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the fourth step creak, though I know no one else is in the house. I leave the kitchen light on just in case, though I'm no longer sure what I'm preparing for, or what might need that light to find its way. Story 6. The missing key asterisk. The basement door was noted as sealed at the commencement of inspection. Each overhead light maintained functionality, casting uniform illumination over the concrete floor. Shelving units appeared orderly, with boxes labeled in neat, consistent handwriting. No item seemed out of place, and the air held a stable temperature. Security footage, however, looped continuously without audio, capturing only the passage of undisturbed hours. A clipboard detailed the regular inventory check, yet one crate remained unaccounted for in all documentation. Every corner was checked thrice. The cameras recorded every second. No shadows moved in the silent footage, and still the padlock was missing. I read the report again, my fingers tracing the typed words on the page. The paper felt rough under my fingertips, official and cold. The smell of fresh ink mixed with the stale coffee growing cold on my desk. Outside my office window, rain tapped against the glass in irregular patterns. each drop catching the fluorescent light before sliding down into darkness. The case had been assigned to me that morning, a routine insurance claim, they said, a warehouse facility reporting missing inventory. Nothing unusual about it, except for the details that refused to align properly, like puzzle pieces forced together despite their incompatible edges. I picked up the phone and dialed the number listed in the file. The rings echoed hollow in my ear before a woman's voice answered, crisp and professional. "I need to schedule a visit to inspect the premises," I said. There was a pause, barely perceptible, but long enough for me to notice the slight intake of breath on the other end. "Of course, when would be convenient?" Her voice carried a subtle tremor, like someone trying to maintain composure while walking on thin ice. I arranged to meet her the following morning and hung up, but the sound of her breathing lingered in my mind. That evening, I spread the case files across my kitchen table. Photographs of the basement, inventory lists, security logs, and insurance documents created a mosaic of information that should have told a clear story. Instead, they whispered contradictions. The security footage timestamp showed continuous recording, yet the digital file had gaps, tiny interruptions that could easily be explained by system glitches or routine maintenance. The inventory sheets listed items by serial number, but the missing crate bore a designation that appeared nowhere else in their system. The handwriting on the labels was indeed neat and consistent, almost mechanically perfect, as if someone had practiced writing the same letters repeatedly. I held one of the photographs up to the light. The basement appeared exactly as described, sterile and organized, but something about the shadows bothered me. They fell in directions that seemed wrong, as if the lights had been repositioned between the time of the incident and when the photographs were taken. Sleep came fitfully that night. I dreamed of concrete floors and fluorescent lights that hummed with an electrical tension that made my teeth ache. The warehouse sat in an industrial district where buildings crouched low against the horizon like sleeping giants. The woman who met me at the entrance was younger than her voice had suggested over the phone. Her handshake was firm, but her palm felt damp despite the cool air. "I'm the facility manager," she said, leading me through a maze of corridors that smelled of cardboard and industrial cleaning solution. "I've been here for several seasons now." Her footsteps echoed against the polished floor, creating a rhythm that seemed deliberately measured. She wore practical shoes with rubber soles that should have been nearly silent, yet each step announced itself with a soft squeak that suggested nervous tension. "The basement is where we keep our high-value inventory," she continued, fishing a set of keys from her pocket. The metal jangled softly as her fingers sorted through them. "Access is restricted to management only." We descended a narrow staircase and the temperature dropped noticeably. The air grew thicker, carrying scents of concrete dust and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The basement matched the photographs perfectly, too perfectly. Every box sat in exactly the same position, every label faced the same direction, every surface appeared recently cleaned. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a frequency that made my head feel light. "Show me where the missing crate was supposed to be," I said. She led me to a section near the back wall, pointing to an empty space between two larger containers. The floor there looked different, slightly darker, as if something had been spilled and carefully cleaned away. "What was in the missing crate?" "Personal effects, items from an estate sale that we were storing for a client." Her answer came too quickly rehearsed. I knelt down and ran my hand across the floor. The concrete felt smooth and cold, but there was a texture difference in the darker area. Something had been scrubbed away with considerable effort. "I'll need to see your employee records," I said, standing up. "Anyone who had access to this area." Her face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, I'll have those ready for you." We climbed back to the main level, and she led me to a small office cluttered with filing cabinets and computer equipment. The smell of burnt coffee hung heavy in the air, mixed with the chemical scent of copy machine toner. She handed me a thin folder containing employment records for 3 people, including herself. The other 2 were listed as part-time workers, both hired within recent months. Their applications were sparse, containing minimal work history and references that consisted only of phone numbers. "I'd like to speak with your other employees," I said. "One no longer works here, the other is currently on leave." Another convenient detail that felt carefully arranged. I made notes in my pad, the pen scratching against paper in the quiet office. Through the window, I could see the parking lot where only 2 cars sat, hers and mine. "What about the security company? Who has access to the footage?" "We handle that internally. The system is password protected and backed up to an external server." She showed me to a computer terminal where the security footage played in a continuous loop. The basement appeared peaceful and undisturbed, cameras capturing every angle with mechanical precision. I watched the timestamp advance, noting the small gaps I had seen in the files. "These interruptions in the recording, what causes them?" "System updates. They happen automatically during off-peak hours." I leaned closer to the screen, studying the angles and shadows. Something was wrong with the perspective in one of the camera feeds. The view seemed slightly different from what I had seen in person, as if the camera had been adjusted between the time of the incident and my visit. "Can I get copies of all the footage from the past month?" Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. "I'll need to check with our legal department first. Privacy concerns, you understand." I left the warehouse with more questions than answers, carrying the scent of that basement on my clothes. The sweet, organic smell seemed to cling to the fabric, growing stronger as I sat in my car, reviewing my notes. That afternoon, I called the references listed on the employee applications. The first number was disconnected. The second rang endlessly without an answer. The third was answered by an elderly man who claimed never to have heard of the person in question. I drove to the address listed for the employee who had recently quit. The apartment building was run down, with broken mailboxes and graffiti covering the walls. The landlord, a tired-looking woman with paint-stained fingers, told me the unit had been vacant for months. "Nobody by that name ever lived here," she said, squinting at the application form I showed her. "This address gets used a lot by people who need a fake address for job applications. Happens more than you'd think." The pieces of the puzzle were becoming more jagged, refusing to fit together in any logical pattern. I returned to my office and spread everything out again, searching for connections I might have missed. The insurance claim was for a substantial amount, enough to make fraud a possibility. But the facility manager seemed genuinely nervous rather than deceptive, and the missing inventory was documented in ways that would be difficult to fabricate completely. I called the estate sale company that had supposedly provided the items in the missing crate. They had no record of any transaction with the warehouse. In fact, they had never heard of the facility or its management company. The investigation was leading me into a maze of false information and dead ends. Every fact I attempted to verify crumbled under scrutiny, yet the evidence of something wrong was undeniable. I decided to return to the warehouse after hours. The facility manager had mentioned that the security system operated continuously, but I wanted to see the place without her watchful presence. The industrial district felt different at night. Streetlights cast long shadows between buildings, and the silence was broken only by the distant hum of traffic and machinery. I parked across from the warehouse and watched the building for signs of activity. The windows remained dark except for the occasional flicker of security lights. I could see the glow of the basement windows at ground level, indicating the fluorescent lights remained on continuously. After waiting for over an hour, I saw a car pull into the parking lot. It was not the facility manager's vehicle, but a dark sedan that moved slowly through the lot before parking near the rear entrance. A figure emerged from the car, too distant for me to identify, and disappeared into the building using what appeared to be a key. I waited, watching the windows for changes in lighting that might indicate movement through the building. The basement lights flickered once, as if someone had passed in front of them, then returned to their steady glow. The person remained inside for what felt like an extended period. I found myself checking my watch repeatedly, though the exact duration seemed less important than the fact that someone was accessing the facility outside normal business hours without any apparent security concerns. When the figure finally emerged, they carried something, a box or container that had not been visible when they entered. They loaded it into the car and drove away, leaving the warehouse looking exactly as it had before their arrival. I followed at a distance, my headlights dimmed, trying to maintain visual contact without being detected. The sedan traveled through residential neighborhoods, taking turns that seemed random until I realized we were moving in a rough circle, returning toward the industrial area from a different direction. The car stopped at another warehouse facility several blocks from the first. The driver repeated the same process, using a key to enter the building and emerging later without the container they had carried from the previous location. I waited until they drove away before approaching the second building. It appeared similar to the first facility, with the same type of security lighting and basement windows. A sign by the entrance listed it as a storage and distribution center, but provided no specific company name. The next morning, I researched the ownership records for both buildings. They were owned by different companies, but the paperwork led to a complex web of subsidiary corporations and shell companies that made the actual ownership difficult to determine. I called the facility manager and asked to schedule another visit. This time, her voice carried a different quality, more strained and less cooperative. "I'm not sure that's necessary. We've provided all the documentation you requested. I have some follow-up questions about your security procedures." The pause was longer this time, filled with the sound of papers rustling in the background. "I'll need to check with my supervisor. Can I call you back?" She never called back. When I tried to reach her later, the phone rang without answer. I drove to the warehouse and found the parking lot empty, with a sign on the door indicating the facility was temporarily closed for maintenance. The basement windows were dark for the first time since I had begun the investigation. I contacted the insurance company to report my findings, but discovered that the claim had been withdrawn. According to their records, the facility manager had called to inform them that the missing inventory had been located and the claim was no longer necessary. The case file was officially closed, but the questions it had raised continued to gnaw at me. I had documented evidence of false employee records, fake addresses, shell companies, and nighttime activities that suggested something far more complex than a simple insurance fraud. I made copies of everything in my files and stored them in a safe deposit box. The investigation had revealed a network of interconnected facilities and false identities, but the purpose behind it remained unclear. The missing crate, the one item that had started everything, had never been found or adequately explained. Weeks later, I drove past the warehouse again. The parking lot was active with vehicles and workers loading trucks. A different company name was displayed on the building, and the basement windows glowed with a familiar fluorescent light. I parked across the street and watched the activity. Workers moved efficiently between the building and the trucks, carrying boxes and containers in a steady stream. Everything appeared normal and legitimate, but I recognized the underlying pattern from my investigation. One of the workers looked familiar. As he turned to carry a box to one of the trucks, I realized it was the same person I had seen entering the facility during my nighttime surveillance. He moved with the same measured gait, carrying containers with the same careful precision. I followed one of the trucks when it left the facility. It traveled through the same residential neighborhoods, taking the same circuitous route I had observed before, eventually arriving at another warehouse in a different part of the industrial district. The pattern was repeating itself with different players and locations, but the same underlying structure. Whatever operation I had stumbled upon was larger and more organized than a simple insurance fraud. It was a network that used legitimate businesses as cover for activities that required careful coordination and multiple layers of false documentation. I never discovered what was actually in those containers being moved between facilities. The investigation had been closed, the claim withdrawn, and the people involved had disappeared into new identities and locations. But the network continued to operate, hidden in plain sight among the legitimate businesses of the industrial district. The basement door had been noted as sealed, but the seal had been broken long before anyone thought to look. The missing padlock was not evidence of a crime, but proof that someone had been very careful to make it appear that no crime had occurred at all. I kept the copies of my files, knowing that someday the pattern might surface again with different players and different locations. The truth had been buried under layers of false documentation and misdirection, but the evidence of its existence remained, waiting for someone to recognize the signs and ask the right questions. The investigation had ended without resolution, leaving me with the unsettling knowledge that some crimes are designed never to be fully understood, only glimpsed through the cracks in their carefully constructed facades. Story 7. The clock on the wall ticked, the second hand paused, then skipped back. I glanced at my watch 5 minutes ahead again. The faded carpet felt uneven underfoot as I walked to the kitchen, the tiles cool and slightly damp. Out of place, a glass teetered on the counter's edge, a shadowed ring beneath it. My fingers traced its rim, and I felt the imprint of another's touch. In the hallway, the mirror reflected not my movements, but stilled patterns, like a photograph taken too late. I reached for the light switch, expecting nothing, but the bulb flickered on. Something had happened here, I knew that much. The question was what exactly and when. I'd come home from work that evening to find the front door unlocked. Not unusual, I'd been distracted lately, forgetting small things. The stress of the past few months had worn me down, made me careless. My partner had been working late shifts at the hospital, leaving me alone with my thoughts more often than I cared for. The house felt different when empty, like it was holding its breath. The logical explanation seemed clear enough. Someone had broken in while I was at the office. They'd searched through our belongings looking for valuables or cash. The glass on the counter that was from them getting a drink of water maybe. Thieves got thirsty too. They'd been careful though, nothing seemed obviously missing. The television still sat in its corner, the laptop remained on the desk. Perhaps I'd surprised them by coming home early and they'd fled through the back door. I called the police naturally. The officer who responded was polite but skeptical. No signs of forced entry, he noted. No broken windows or damaged locks. The back door stood slightly ajar, but the latch was finicky. It could have swung open on its own. He took my statement with the weary patience of someone who'd heard similar stories before. Probably just my imagination, he suggested. Stress could make people paranoid. But I knew what I'd felt when I touched that glass. The warmth of recent contact, the slight residue of moisture from someone else's lips. The way the kitchen smelled different, not quite right, like when someone unfamiliar uses your soap. Over the following days, I tried to convince myself the officer was right. I'd been working too many hours, sleeping poorly. My partner's absence at night left me jumpy, prone to hearing sounds that weren't there. The mind could play tricks, especially when exhausted. I'd probably left the door unlocked myself, moved the glass without remembering. Simple explanations for simple mysteries. Yet the feeling persisted. A presence lingered in the house, invisible but undeniable. I'd catch myself checking locks twice, peering into closets that should have been empty. The mirror in the hallway began to bother me most. Sometimes I'd glimpse movement in my peripheral vision, turn to look, and see only my own reflection staring back with eyes that seemed too wide, too startled. The smell came next, faint at first, like cologne or aftershave that didn't belong to either of us. It would appear in different rooms, the bedroom, the living room, sometimes the bathroom. When I mentioned it to my partner, they suggested it might be drifting from a neighbor's apartment. Old buildings had thin walls, shared ventilation systems. Scents traveled in mysterious ways. But this wasn't traveling, this was residing. I started noticing other things. Books shifted slightly on their shelves. The coffee maker, which I always turned off after use, would be warm in the mornings. Towels hung differently in the bathroom, folded with a precision I didn't possess. Small changes that could have been my own forgetfulness, but accumulated into something more troubling. The dreams began around the same time. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid sequences that felt more like memories. In them I'd be lying in bed, aware of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that paused outside our bedroom door. I'd try to move, to call out, but my body wouldn't respond. The footsteps would continue, moving through the house with intimate familiarity. I'd wake with my heart racing, sheets damp with perspiration. The house would be silent, my partner sleeping peacefully beside me. But the smell would be there, that foreign cologne, stronger now, as if someone had just passed through the room. My partner grew concerned about my behavior. I'd become jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder. I'd installed additional locks on the doors and windows, checked them multiple times each night. When they asked about my sudden paranoia, I struggled to explain. How could I describe the certainty that we weren't alone without sounding unhinged? The breaking point came on a night when my partner was working a double shift. I'd fallen asleep on the couch, the television murmuring in the background. I woke to the sound of running water. The bathroom faucet was on, steam fogging the mirror. I approached slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The water was hot, almost scalding. Fresh condensation covered the mirror's surface. In it, I could see the outline of a handprint larger than mine. As I watched, the steam began to clear, and for just a moment I saw another face looking back at me. Familiar but wrong, like seeing yourself in a funhouse mirror. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the door frame. When I looked again, only my own terrified expression stared back. The handprint had vanished with the steam. That's when the second version began to surface, rising from some deeper place in my consciousness like bubbles from the bottom of a dark pond. What if there had been no intruder? What if the presence I felt, the sounds I heard, the scents that didn't belong, what if they were all emanating from me? Not the me I knew, the me I remembered being, but some other version. Someone who shared my face but not my memories, who moved through my life like a shadow I couldn't see. The idea should have been absurd, but it explained too much. The gaps in my memory, the objects moved in ways I couldn't recall moving them. The exhaustion that seemed to come from nowhere, as if I'd been active while believing myself at rest. The way my partner sometimes looked at me with confusion, as if I'd said things I had no memory of saying. I began to pay closer attention to these moments of disconnection. The morning I woke fully dressed in clothes I didn't remember putting on. The afternoon I found groceries in the refrigerator that I couldn't recall buying, items I didn't even like. The evening my partner asked about the phone call I'd apparently made to their work, a conversation that existed only in their memory, not mine. The mirror in the hallway became a focal point of my growing unease. I'd stand before it, studying my reflection for signs of something amiss. Sometimes my eyes seemed different, not the color or shape, but the expression behind them. As if someone else was looking out through them, someone who knew things I didn't. The smell of cologne made more sense now. It wasn't coming from an intruder or drifting from neighboring apartments. It was mine, applied by hands I couldn't remember using, during times I couldn't recall living. But why would I wear cologne I didn't own, that smelled nothing like the fragrances I preferred? Sleep became treacherous. I'd go to bed exhausted, but wake feeling as if I'd been active all night. My muscles would ache in strange ways, and sometimes there would be dirt under my fingernails despite having showered before sleep. Once I woke to find mud on the bathroom floor, tracked in from outside. The front door was locked, the key in its usual place, but my shoes were damp with dew. My partner's concern deepened into something approaching fear. They'd ask about conversations we'd supposedly had, plans we'd apparently made, all of which existed in a space my conscious mind couldn't access. When they suggested I see a doctor, I felt both relief and terror. Relief that someone else recognized something was wrong, terror at what we might discover. But which version was real? The intruder who moved through our home with ghostly familiarity, or the stranger who sometimes inhabited my own skin? Both felt equally true and equally impossible. Both explained the evidence while creating new mysteries. I found myself standing in front of that hallway mirror more frequently, searching for answers in my own reflection. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement that didn't match my own, a hand raised when mine remained at my side, a head turned when I was facing forward. The mirror seemed to show not what I was doing, but what I was about to do, or what I had already done in some other version of reality. The glass on the kitchen counter had been joined by others. I'd find them throughout the house, always in slightly precarious positions, always bearing the invisible residue of recent use. When I'd ask my partner about them, they'd look confused. They were my glasses, apparently. I'd used them myself. But I had no memory of drinking from them, no recollection of placing them just so on counters and tables. They felt foreign in my hands, as if they'd been shaped for someone else's grip. The footsteps in my dreams grew more frequent, more distinct. Sometimes I'd dream of following them, moving through the house in darkness, guided by an instinct that wasn't quite my own. I'd watch my hands open doors, reach for objects, perform actions with purpose I couldn't understand. In these dreams, I was both observer and participant, watching myself move through familiar spaces that somehow felt foreign. Upon waking, I'd find evidence of these nocturnal journeys, doors standing open that I always kept closed, items moved from their usual places, the lingering scent of that strange cologne, stronger in the morning air. My partner began sleeping more lightly, waking at sounds I couldn't hear. They'd ask if I'd gotten up during the night, gone to the kitchen or bathroom. Sometimes I had, according to them, but I retained no memory of these excursions. I began to wonder if I was sleepwalking, but sleepwalkers typically moved clumsily, bumping into furniture, acting confused. According to my partner, my nighttime movements were purposeful, deliberate. The two narratives began to blur together like watercolors in rain. The intruder and the stranger inside me became indistinguishable. Perhaps they were the same entity, a presence that existed in the spaces between my conscious moments. Or perhaps consciousness itself was more fractured than I'd ever imagined, capable of splitting into multiple streams that rarely converged. I stopped trying to determine which version was true. Both were true. Neither was true. Truth became less important than survival, and survival meant accepting that reality was more fluid than I'd previously believed. The house continued to feel inhabited by more than just the two of us, but now I understood that the extra presence might not be foreign at all. It might be me, or a version of me, living a parallel existence in the same space. We shared the same body, the same home, but not the same awareness. Standing before the hallway mirror now, I no longer search for answers. Instead, I simply observe, waiting to see which version of myself will look back. Sometimes it's the me I remember being. Sometimes it's the stranger who wears my face. And sometimes, in the space between recognition and confusion, I catch a glimpse of someone else entirely, the intruder who might have been me all along. The clock on the wall continues to skip backward, and I no longer bother to check my watch. Time moves differently when you're not sure which version of yourself is experiencing it. The glass on the counter has been joined by others, and I have stopped questioning their origin. They belong to all of us, me, the intruder, the stranger, whoever else might be sharing this space between certainty and doubt. My partner asks fewer questions now, perhaps sensing that answers would only lead to more questions. We exist in a state of careful equilibrium, acknowledging the presence without naming it, living alongside the mystery without demanding its resolution. Because some truths are too large to fit inside a single version of reality. Some answers require multiple questions to be asked simultaneously. And sometimes the most honest response to a mystery is not to solve it, but to learn to live within it, accepting that understanding and truth might be entirely different things. Story 8. I stood frozen in the entrance, eyes fixed on the solitary chair angled oddly in the corner. The room's usual arrangement was disrupted, yet everything else appeared untouched, poised in its mundane stillness. The ceiling fan's low hum filled the quiet, barely stirring the air that felt stale. Shadows seemed bolder, stretching across surfaces like they were claiming new territory. My skin tingled with an awareness that the scene was incomplete, like I had walked into a painting still waiting for its final stroke. Just then, the faint scent of lavender, far too recent, crept in unnoticed before. The chair shouldn't have been there, not in that corner, not at that angle. I knew this room like the lines on my palms, every piece of furniture memorized through countless visits. The chair belonged by the window where she always sat to read her morning paper, where she would pause between sips of coffee to watch the neighborhood wake up. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The lavender scent grew stronger, clinging to the stagnant air like a confession waiting to be heard. She wore lavender perfume, but sparingly, just a touch behind her ears. This was different. This was deliberate. The coffee cup sat on the side table, still holding dregs that had long since cooled. A lipstick mark on the rim, perfectly preserved. The newspaper lay folded beside it, creased as though someone had been reading the same section repeatedly. I moved closer, noting how the paper trembled slightly under the fan's weak current. My fingers hovered over the cup's handle, still warm, not hot, but warm enough to suggest recent use. The contradiction settled in my stomach like a stone. She had been gone for 3 days now. The neighbors had called when they noticed the mail piling up, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. I had a key, had always had a key. She trusted me with her space, her routines, her small secrets, the kind of trust that develops slowly, built through shared silences and unspoken understanding. I was supposed to check on her when she didn't answer her phone. I was supposed to make sure everything was all right. But everything wasn't all right. The chair stared back at me from its wrong corner, its burgundy upholstery catching the dim light. I could almost see her there, hands folded in her lap, watching me with that patient expression she wore when she knew something I didn't. She had a way of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was thinking, processing information behind eyes that revealed nothing. I walked to the kitchen, drawn by habit more than purpose. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, joined by the soft tick of the wall clock. Everything appeared normal, dishes clean and put away, counters wiped spotless, the small touches that spoke of a life lived with quiet precision. But the salt shaker sat beside the stove instead of in the cabinet, another small displacement, another wrongness that whispered of interruption. My phone had been ringing for days. Her sister, worried about missed calls, her doctor's office, confirming an appointment that had come and gone, the grocery store, wondering about her usual order. Each call added weight to the growing certainty that something had shifted, that the careful pattern of her days had been broken. I opened the refrigerator, not sure what I expected to find. Milk that had soured, vegetables beginning to wilt, the natural decay that follows absence, but everything looked fresh, arranged with the same meticulous care she brought to all aspects of her life. The lavender scent followed me back to the living room, stronger now, as though my movement had stirred it from its hiding places. I found myself studying the chair again, trying to understand its significance. Why move it? Why there, to that specific corner where it served no purpose, where it blocked nothing and offered no better view? I sat on the sofa, sinking into cushions that held the faint impression of regular use. From this angle, the displaced chair seemed to be watching the front door, positioned like a sentinel, angled to observe anyone who might enter. The realization came slowly, creeping through my consciousness like water through fabric. She had moved the chair, not someone else, her. She had dragged it across the room, positioning it just so, creating a vantage point that hadn't existed before. But why? The newspaper caught my attention again. I picked it up, noting how the pages fell open to the local section. A small article about a missing person had been circled in blue ink. A woman described as quiet and reliable, someone who kept to herself but maintained cordial relationships with neighbors, someone who had simply stopped appearing in the places where she was expected to be. The description could have been about her, could have been about anyone, really. The kind of person who moves through life without making waves, whose absence is noted only when routines are disrupted. I set the paper down, my hands trembling slightly. The article was dated from the week before she disappeared, before anyone knew she was missing, before the calls started coming. The lavender scent seemed to pulse now, rising and falling like breath. I followed it toward the hallway, past family photographs that watched my progress with frozen smiles. Her bedroom door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of unmade bed, sheets twisted as though someone had left in haste. I pushed the door open wider. The scent was strongest here, concentrated in the still air. Her dresser top held the usual collection of items: jewelry box, hand cream, a small bottle of perfume, its cap removed, lying on its side. The bottle was nearly empty now, its contents absorbed by the room's atmosphere, deliberately emptied, purposefully dispersed. I picked up the bottle, feeling its lightness in my palm. She was careful with her perfume, using it sparingly to make it last. This bottle should have lasted months more. Instead, it had been sacrificed to create this lingering presence, this olfactory ghost that announced her absence more powerfully than any note could have. The bed drew my attention, covers pulled back on one side, pillow still holding the indent of a head, but the other side remained perfectly made, untouched. She had been sleeping alone, but the positioning suggested she had been leaving space for someone or something. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to piece together the fragments of evidence. The moved chair, the emptied perfume, the circled article. Each element felt significant, but their connection remained elusive, like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces from different boxes. My phone buzzed against my hip, her sister again, probably, or the police finally taking the missing person report seriously. I let it ring, unwilling to break the strange intimacy of this investigation. The room held answers, I was certain. I just needed to learn how to read them. The closet door stood open, revealing clothes hanging in neat rows, everything in its place, organized by color and season. But one hanger swung empty, creating a gap in the orderly display, a space where something had been removed. I stood and approached the closet, running my fingers along the empty hanger. Metal, still warm from whatever garment it had recently held. The surrounding clothes pressed closer together, as though trying to fill the void. What had she taken, and where had she gone? The questions multiplied, breeding in the spaces between certainty and doubt. I found myself moving through the apartment like a detective, searching for clues that might explain the inexplicable. But every answer I found only generated more questions, more uncertainty. The bathroom revealed more displacement, toothbrush missing from its holder, medicine cabinet slightly ajar, revealing gaps where bottles should have been. Someone preparing for departure, but not the kind of departure that gets announced. I returned to the living room, drawn again to that oddly positioned chair. I sat in it this time, feeling the worn upholstery conform to my body. From this angle, I could see the entire room, the hallway, the front door, a perfect observation post. She had been watching, waiting, but for what? The coffee cup still sat on the side table, its contents now completely cold. I lifted it to my nose, breathing in the familiar aroma of her preferred blend. But underneath the coffee scent, something else lingered, something bitter and medicinal. I set the cup down carefully, my mind racing, the warm coffee, the fresh lavender, the carefully arranged scene. None of it made sense if she had been gone for days. Unless she hadn't been gone at all. The thought hit me like a physical blow, rearranging everything I thought I understood. What if the calls had been ignored not because she was missing, but because she was hiding? What if the drawn curtains and piled mail were camouflage, not abandonment? I stood abruptly, the chair creaking under the sudden movement. My eyes swept the room again, seeing it now as a stage set rather than a crime scene. Every element carefully placed to tell a specific story. The story of a disappearance that might not have been a disappearance at all. But if she was hiding, where was she hiding, and from whom? The newspaper article seemed to glow on the coffee table, its circled text a beacon in the dim room. I read it again, more carefully this time. The missing woman had been described as having no known enemies, no obvious reasons to vanish. But people don't disappear without reason. There's always a catalyst, always a moment when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving. I found myself thinking about our last conversation, replaying it in my mind like a recording I could analyze for hidden meanings. She had seemed distracted, kept glancing toward the windows as though expecting something or someone. Had she asked me about the spare key, I couldn't remember clearly, but the question felt familiar, like an echo of something recently heard. She had been planning even then, setting pieces in motion for whatever was to come. The lavender scent began to fade as the afternoon wore on, dissipating like evidence being erased. Soon, this room would smell normal again, would lose the artificial atmosphere that had been so carefully created. The performance would end, leaving only questions and the lingering sense that I had missed something crucial. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtains slightly, peering out at the street below. Normal suburban life continued its predictable rhythm. Children playing, dogs being walked, the mailman making his rounds. But somewhere in this ordinary landscape, she was watching too. I could feel her presence like pressure in my ears, the certainty that I was being observed even as I observed. My phone buzzed again, this time I answered. Her sister's voice crackled through the speaker, tight with worry and frustration. Had I found anything, any sign of where she might have gone? I looked around the room one more time, taking in the displaced chair, the empty perfume bottle, the circled newspaper article. Evidence of a carefully orchestrated vanishing, performed by someone who understood that the most effective way to disappear is to make others complicit in your absence. I told her sister I would keep looking, that I was sure we would find answers soon. The lie came easily, practiced through repetition, because the truth was more complicated than anyone wanted to hear. The truth was that some people don't want to be found, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. As I prepared to leave, I repositioned the chair back by the window, restoring the room's familiar arrangement. But I left the perfume bottle on its side, the newspaper folded to the circled article. Some disruptions, I realized, were meant to be permanent. The lavender scent had almost completely faded by the time I locked the door behind me. But I carried it with me as I walked away, a reminder that absence can be as deliberate as presence, and that sometimes the most profound disappearances happen in plain sight. The key felt heavy in my pocket as I drove home, weighted with the knowledge that I had been entrusted with more than just access to her apartment. I had been given a role in her performance, made part of a story whose ending I might never know. And perhaps that was exactly how she had planned it. Story 9. My gaze remained fixed on the narrow corridor, its expanse unnaturally empty, like a canvas awaiting a stroke of mischief. Somewhere at the edge of perception, a draft whispered its presence, unsettling the undisturbed layer of dust along the floor's edge. Echoes should have reverberated softly, but the air held its breath, denying the faintest sound. Even the dim lamp's glow appeared strained, as if reluctant to illuminate what lay beyond. I waited, drawn into this silent pact of expectancy. Then, without warning, the slight shimmer of a misplaced reflection caught my eye a glint where darkness should have prevailed. The glass fragment under my fingertip feels warm now, though it should be cold. I press harder, watching the skin around it pale, and suddenly I'm back there again. The hallway, the waiting, the way everything seemed suspended between what was and what might be. But that was months ago, or was it weeks? Time has this way of folding in on itself when you spend too many hours staring at evidence bags and witness statements that contradict each other in subtle, maddening ways. The woman who called it in had said she heard something, a sound like breaking, not glass, she insisted when I pressed her for details, something softer, like paper tearing, but louder, more deliberate. I remember writing that down, paper tearing but louder. The words looked strange on the page, disconnected from meaning. She lived in the apartment across the hall, had lived there for 3 years, she said, never heard anything unusual before. The walls were thin, she explained, thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television most evenings. A soft murmur of voices and canned laughter that had become part of her routine. But that night, silence. The absence of sound can be more unsettling than noise. I learned that during my first year on the force, walking beats through neighborhoods where the usual symphony of urban life would suddenly cease. Dogs would stop barking. Cars would seem to avoid certain streets. Even the wind would hold its breath. The apartment had been neat when we entered, almost aggressively tidy. Books arranged by height on shelves that showed no dust. Kitchen counters bare except for a single coffee mug, washed and dried, sitting beside the sink. The bed made with military precision. But in the living room, that one piece of glass, no larger than a thumbnail, catching light from the window in a way that seemed deliberate, placed, not fallen. My partner at the time said it was probably nothing. A chip from a drinking glass, maybe. People dropped things, but there were no other glasses visible anywhere in the apartment. Just that one mug by the sink, intact and unremarkable. I bagged the fragment anyway. Standard procedure, though for what crime I couldn't say. The tenant had been missing for 4 days when we finally gained entry. His supervisor at the insurance office had called when he failed to show for meetings, missed appointments, clients left waiting, the kind of behavior that creates ripples in an otherwise orderly existence. But missing isn't necessarily suspicious. People leave. They walk away from jobs, from leases, from lives that no longer fit. The law allows for voluntary disappearance, for the simple human desire to become someone else somewhere else. Still, something about the apartment bothered me, the way it felt staged, as if someone had arranged it to tell a specific story about the person who lived there, careful, methodical, alone. I found myself returning to that hallway over the following weeks, not officially, just passing by during off hours, standing where I had stood that first day, trying to understand what had caught my attention. The building's fluorescent lighting cast the same reluctant glow. The same draft moved through the corridor, stirring dust that seemed to resettle in identical patterns. The neighbor, the woman who had called it in, would sometimes emerge from her apartment when I was there. We would nod politely, exchange brief pleasantries about the weather or the building's aging ventilation system, but I could see the questions in her eyes, the same questions that kept me coming back. She had mentioned the television sounds, how they had stopped 3 nights before she called the police. Not gradually, she said, all at once like someone had pulled a plug. I asked if she had knocked on his door, checked to see if everything was all right. She hadn't. Something had held her back, a feeling, she said, the kind of intuition that keeps you from opening doors you should probably leave closed. The glass fragment was analyzed, of course. Standard automotive safety glass, the kind used inside windows, common enough to be meaningless. No fingerprints, no DNA, no connection to any registered vehicle in the area. But automotive glass doesn't typically find its way into third-floor apartments unless carried there deliberately. And the fragment was clean, too clean, as if it had been washed before being placed on that living room floor. I started checking parking records for the neighborhood, looking for vehicles reported stolen or abandoned around the time of the disappearance. Found 3 possibles, but none with missing windows, none with any apparent connection to the missing man. The insurance company provided his employment records, 15 years of steady attendance, no disciplinary actions, no conflicts with colleagues or clients. He processed claims for property damage, mostly residential fires and break-ins, routine paperwork that rarely required face-to-face interaction. His supervisor described him as reliable but distant, the kind of employee who arrived on time, completed his work efficiently, and left without engaging in office social rituals, polite but unreachable. I spoke with a few of his clients, recent ones whose claims he had handled. They remembered him as thorough but impersonal. He asked the necessary questions, documented the required information, and processed their paperwork without unnecessary conversation. One woman mentioned that he had seemed particularly interested in the details of her break-in, had asked questions beyond what the forms required, about whether she had noticed anything unusual in the days before the incident, whether she had felt watched or followed. She had assumed it was standard procedure. Insurance companies, she reasoned, needed to verify that claims were legitimate, but thinking back, she said, his questions had felt more personal than professional. I pulled her file from the company's records, a straightforward case. Someone had entered her apartment through a living room window, taking jewelry and electronics. No signs of violence, no evidence of personal motivation. The kind of crime that happens thousands of times every day in cities everywhere. But her apartment was only 6 blocks from his building. I started mapping his recent cases, looking for patterns, geographic clusters, unusual circumstances, anything that might explain why a man who processed insurance claims would disappear from a spotless apartment, leaving behind only a fragment of automotive glass. Most of the cases were scattered throughout the metropolitan area, random locations connected only by the misfortune of their residents, but 3 others were within walking distance of his building, all break-ins, all involving entry through windows. The police reports for these incidents were routine. No suspects, no witnesses, no unusual circumstances noted by the investigating officers. Property stolen, insurance claims filed, cases closed due to lack of evidence. But I wondered if he had visited these locations personally, if his interest in the details had extended beyond what his job required. I drove to each address, walking through the neighborhoods at different times of day, looking for sight lines and hiding places, for the kinds of details that might attract someone who spent his days cataloging other people's losses. The 3rd location felt different, an apartment complex with multiple entry points and limited visibility from the street. the kind of place where someone could observe residents' routines without being noticed. I sat in my car across the street one evening, watching windows light up as people returned from work, trying to imagine what he might have seen, what patterns he might have recognized. A young woman emerged from the building around 9 o'clock, walking quickly toward the bus stop. She glanced over her shoulder twice before reaching the corner, the kind of unconscious vigilance that develops when you feel observed but can't identify the source. I followed her route the next evening, timing her departure. She left at the same time, walked the same path, displayed the same nervous awareness of her surroundings. The third evening, I positioned myself near the bus stop, pretending to read while observing her approach. She was attractive in an understated way, the kind of person who might not realize she was being watched until the attention became threatening. When she reached the stop, I approached casually, showed my identification, and explained that I was investigating incidents in the neighborhood, asked if she had noticed anyone unusual, anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to the building or its residents. She had a man in a dark sedan who had been parked across the street on several occasions, always in the evening, always alone. She had assumed he was waiting for someone, but he never seemed to pick anyone up or drop anyone off. She couldn't describe him clearly. The distance and lighting made details impossible, but she remembered feeling uncomfortable about his presence, the way he seemed to be studying the building rather than simply waiting. I asked when she had last seen him. She thought for a moment, counting backward through her mental calendar. The week before the insurance man disappeared. The connection felt significant, though I couldn't articulate why. A man who processed break-in claims, parked outside buildings where break-ins had occurred, disappearing after leaving behind evidence of automotive glass. But correlation isn't causation, and feeling watched isn't evidence of a crime. I requested surveillance footage from businesses near his apartment building. Most had systems that recorded over themselves after a few days, but a convenience store on the corner kept files for 2 weeks. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, but it showed the street in front of his building during the relevant time period. I spent hours watching cars pass, pedestrians walk by, delivery trucks make their rounds. On the night before his disappearance, a dark sedan appeared in the frame around 10 o'clock. It moved slowly, as if the driver was searching for something or someone. The car circled the block twice before parking just outside the camera's range. I could see part of the rear bumper, but not enough to identify the make or model, not enough to read the license plate. It remained there for approximately 40 minutes before driving away. I enhanced the image as much as possible, but the resolution was too poor to reveal useful details. Just the suggestion of a vehicle that might or might not be connected to a man who might or might not be missing voluntarily. The glass fragment had been bothering me, not just its presence, but its placement, too visible to be accidental, too deliberate to be coincidental. I returned to the apartment building one more time, asking the landlord for permission to examine the missing man's unit again. The space felt different now, less staged, more abandoned, as if whatever story it had been telling was no longer necessary. I knelt where I had found the glass, studying the floor from different angles. The fragment had been positioned to catch light from the window at a specific time of day, when the sun was low enough to create that glint that had first caught my attention. Someone had wanted it to be found, had placed it deliberately to draw focus to this spot, this room, this absence. But why leave a clue that led nowhere, evidence that proved nothing? Unless the point wasn't to solve a mystery, but to create one. I sat in the empty apartment as afternoon light moved across the walls, thinking about the precision required to predict exactly where that fragment would be most visible, the patience needed to calculate angles and timing. The same methodical attention to detail that had characterized the missing man's work, his life, his disappearance. Outside, I could hear the neighbor moving around in her apartment, the soft sounds of someone preparing dinner, living an ordinary evening in a space that had become extraordinary simply by proximity to absence. I wondered if she still missed the sound of his television, if the silence had become as much a part of her routine as the noise had been. When I finally left the building, I found myself walking the same route the young woman took to the bus stop, following the path that someone else had watched, documented, perhaps even practiced. The dark sedan was parked across the street. Same position, same patient stillness, but this time I could see the driver clearly. He was watching me watch him. A middle-aged man with unremarkable features and the kind of careful composure that comes from years of observing without being observed. We stared at each other through 2 layers of glass and 30 feet of evening air, neither of us moving, neither of us acknowledging what we both understood. Then he started the engine and drove away. I memorized the license plate, but when I ran it the next morning, the registration came back to a vehicle that had been reported stolen 2 weeks earlier. The owner had no connection to the missing insurance man or to any of the break-in cases. Another fragment, another piece of evidence that pointed toward something I couldn't name. The woman at the bus stop stopped taking her usual route. I saw her a few days later, walking in the opposite direction toward a different stop 6 blocks away. She had changed her pattern, disrupted whatever routine had made her predictable. Smart but also sad, another small victory for the watchers over the watched. I filed my report with the standard language about ongoing investigation and insufficient evidence. The missing person case would remain open but inactive unless new information emerged. But I kept the glass fragment, not officially. It had been logged and processed and found to be irrelevant to any prosecutable crime. No one would miss it from the evidence room. I carry it now in my jacket pocket, a reminder of questions that don't have answers and answers that don't solve anything. Sometimes I take it out and hold it up to the light, watching it cast tiny rainbows on whatever surface is nearby, thinking about the precision required to place it exactly where it would be found, the patience needed to wait for someone like me to find it. The insurance man never returned to his apartment. His company eventually hired someone else to process property damage claims. His landlord cleaned out the unit and rented it to a graduate student who plays music loud enough for the neighbor to hear through the thin walls. But I still drive by sometimes, still park where the dark sedan used to wait, still wonder if someone is watching me the way I once watched others. The fragment grows warm in my palm as I think about this, about the difference between disappearing and being disappeared, between leaving voluntarily and being encouraged to leave. About the thin line between investigating a crime and becoming part of one. The hallway looks different now when I remember it, less empty, more expectant, as if it was waiting not for something to happen, but for someone to understand what had already occurred. And maybe that's enough. Maybe understanding is its own kind of resolution, even when it doesn't lead to justice or closure or any of the things we tell ourselves we're searching for. The glass catches the light from my window as I write this, casting patterns on the paper that shift and change as the sun moves across the sky. Deliberate and random, planned and accidental. Like everything else in this case, that isn't quite a case. Like everything else I've learned, that doesn't quite count as knowledge. The fragment will be warm when I pick it up again. It always is, as if it remembers being part of something larger, something that mattered in ways I'm still trying to understand. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, just carried. Like pieces of glass that catch the light at precisely the right angle to remind us that we're always being watched, even when we can't see who's doing the watching. Especially then, story 10. It wasn't the first time I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. The usual creak of the hinges didn't echo, and I assumed the wind had done its part again. I didn't bother to check inside this time. The shadows stayed where I remembered them. The light from the hallway stretched into the room, outlining shapes that seemed familiar yet not. A slight draft kissed the back of my neck, almost unusual for this time of year. I counted each step as I moved away, each sounding softer than the last. The door didn't latch when I pulled it behind me. I didn't return to fix it. The coffee mug sits cold on the kitchen counter. I remember filling it, steam rising like small prayers toward the ceiling. But when did I stop drinking? The ceramic feels foreign against my palm, as if someone else had chosen this particular cup, this particular morning routine that no longer feels like mine. There's a photograph missing from the mantel. I know this because the dust outline remains, a perfect rectangle where something once stood. I can almost recall what it contained: faces, perhaps a celebration, but the specifics slip away like water through cupped hands. The absence feels more present than whatever was there before. She used to hum while washing dishes, low, tuneless melodies that filled the spaces between our conversations. The silence now has weight, pressing against my eardrums until I find myself holding my breath, waiting for a sound that never comes. I've started leaving the radio on, but the voices feel like intruders. The basement door sticks. It's always stuck, requiring that particular twist of the handle and upward lift that only comes from years of repetition. But lately I find it slightly ajar, the latch not quite catching. The darkness below seems deeper, more patient. I tell myself it's the settling of the house, the natural expansion and contraction of old wood. I found her earring under the couch cushion. Small, silver, catching the afternoon light that slants through the living room window. I held it in my palm, feeling its familiar weight, remembering how she would unconsciously touch her earlobe when thinking. The matching one is nowhere to be found. The neighbors have stopped waving. Not in any obvious way, they still nod, still maintain that careful distance of suburban politeness. But their eyes don't quite meet mine anymore, and conversations end a beat too soon. I wonder what they see when they look at this house, at me standing in the doorway collecting mail that mostly isn't mine anymore. There are pills scattered across the bathroom floor, small, white, unremarkable things that could be aspirin or something else entirely. I don't remember dropping them, don't remember opening any bottles. They crunch underfoot like tiny bones, and I sweep them into my palm without examining them too closely. The phone rang once in the middle of the night. By the time I reached it, only dial tone remained. The caller ID showed no number, just a blank screen that reflected my face back at me, distorted and pale. I stood there holding the receiver until the automated voice told me to hang up and try again. Her toothbrush is still in the holder, blue bristles softened by use, the handle worn smooth where her thumb would rest. I haven't moved it, haven't thrown it away. Sometimes I catch myself buying the brand she preferred, standing in the pharmacy aisle with packages I don't remember selecting. The garden shows signs of care I don't remember providing. Weeds pulled, soil turned, new growth emerging in neat rows. My hands are clean, my fingernails unbroken, yet the earth smells fresh and recently disturbed. The shovel lanes against the shed, its blade caked with dark soil that wasn't there before. I keep finding notes written in my handwriting, grocery lists, reminders, fragments of thoughts I don't recall thinking. The paper is always slightly damp, the ink sometimes smeared as if written in haste or with trembling fingers. One simply says, "Check the door," in letters that look urgent, desperate. The car's odometer shows miles I haven't driven, not many 50, perhaps 60, but enough to notice. The passenger seat is adjusted differently, pushed back as if someone taller had been sitting there. There's mud on the floor mats, a particular red clay I don't recognize from anywhere nearby. Sleep comes in fragments now. I wake to find myself in different rooms, fully clothed, sometimes holding objects I don't remember picking up. A book, a kitchen knife, once a handful of old photographs with faces I should recognize but somehow don't. The dreams that wake me fade too quickly, leaving only the taste of metal and the sound of something being dragged across wooden floors. The police officer who came to the door had kind eyes and careful questions. He asked about routines, about changes, about the last time I had spoken to anyone who knew me well. I answered honestly, I think, though his expression grew more concerned with each response. He left his card on the kitchen table where it remains, slowly curling at the edges. There's blood under my fingernails, not much, just thin crescents of rust brown that could be anything, could be nothing. I scrub until my hands are raw, but traces remain, persistent as guilt, stubborn as memory. I wonder if it's mine, if I've been unconsciously scratching at something that won't heal. The mirror in the hallway reflects someone I'm not sure I recognize anymore. The face is familiar but changed, hollowed in places, sharper where it should be soft. The eyes hold secrets I haven't told myself yet, and I find myself avoiding that particular stretch of wall, taking longer routes through the house. I discovered a spare key hidden under the garden stone, not where I remember placing one, not a location that makes sense for security. It fits the front door perfectly, turns with the smooth ease of frequent use. I wonder who else knows about this key, who might have been using it while I sleep or when I take those drives I can't quite remember. The answering machine blinks with messages I'm afraid to play. The counter shows 7, then 5, then 12, as if the number itself is uncertain. When I finally press the button, there's only static and the sound of breathing, patient and familiar. Sometimes I think I hear my own voice, speaking words I don't remember saying. She's been gone for weeks now, or maybe months. The timeline blurs like watercolors in rain, events bleeding into each other until I can't separate what happened from what I feared might happen. Her clothes still hang in the closet, still smell faintly of her perfume, though I know this should have faded by now. The door is open again. I can see it from where I sit, that familiar gap between frame and wood, the darkness beyond patient and waiting. I should close it, should check what's inside, should face whatever I've been avoiding. Instead, I count my steps as I walk away, each one softer than the last, and I don't look back when the latch fails to catch.